Introduction, chapters 4 through 5 of The Origins of Christianity by Thomas Whittaker. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Introduction, The Origins of Christianity. Chapter 4, Alexandrian Judaism. The rather unspeculative, though not unimaginative, character of these ideas need not be attributed to any peculiarity of the Semitic as distinguished from the Aryan race. Indeed, it is not unlikely that they were in part the result of contact with Aryan Persia. Their development is sufficiently explained by the circumstances of the Palestinian Jews. Among the Jews of the dispersion, those of Alexandria, who had opportunities of coming in contact with Greek philosophy, showed no intrinsic want of aptitude for metaphysics. Philo, their most eminent representative, was an able thinker, though trammelled, like our Western scholastics of the Middle Age, by the necessity of limiting himself where revealed religion has spoken. If there was no such living coercive authority to check him, he personally desired to remain a faithful adherent to the Mosaic law. He was at work during the early years of the Christian era, but the movement he represents can be traced back, like the production of the apocalyptic literature, to at least the 2nd century BC. When Hebrew religion and Greek philosophy met, some degree of interest could not fail to be aroused on both sides. We know more about the impression made on the Jews. The thinkers among them perceived that some among the Greeks had attained to as pure ideas of divinity as their own. To the original contact with Greek thought must be ascribed, indeed, the beginnings of the effort to explain away those anthropomorphisms in the Bible which were a scandal to Jewish and Christian theologians, till the higher criticism shifted the problem. What is known as the wisdom literature is already touched by the Greek spirit. Philo's historical significance is due to his strenuous effort of reconciliation on the same line. In elaborating, with the aid of his philosophical learning, the half-personalized abstractions called wisdom or spirit or word, through which the transcendent God of Platonizing Judaism could be conceived as acting on matter, he provided Christian speculators an advance with their conception of the Logos. The difference is that for Philo, the personality of the Logos or mediating word could be set aside when he was in a less mythological mood and more anxious to agree with the philosophers. It took its start not from interest in an actual person or a concrete myth, but from more or less conscious philosophical mythologizing to meet certain difficulties of a monotheistic creed. But if Israel had received its monotheism by divine revelation, how was the attainment of the same conviction by heathen philosophers to be explained? To admit that it could be attained by natural light would make revelation superfluous, or would place the chosen people on an inferior level. In the absence of philological science, it was easy to devise an explanation. The Pentateuch, as everyone knew, was of primeval antiquity. The Greek philosophers, it was equally well known, had all borrowed their systems from the East. Evidently, then, the Mosaic revelation, or some fragments of it, had been communicated to Plato and Aristotle. This was, in its way, a liberal view. It permitted the pious Israelite to read and appreciate the books of the heathen. The more open-minded of the Christian fathers in their turn found it very convenient, and as late as the 17th century it was still quite alive. In any case, the knowledge that the educated portion of the heathen world, so far as it was religious at all, was permeated with a philosophical theology not unlike that which could be stated as the essence of their own religion, furnished the cosmopolitan Jews with an excellent opening for proselytizing. The claim could be made to instruct the multitude authoritatively in a wisdom long recognized by the few in their own lands. Besides, the Jews came from the East, to which the peoples of the West were accustomed to look as the home of esoteric mysteries. One form which proselytism took was accordingly the writing of those Greek compositions in verse known as the Sibylline oracles. The Kumaean, or some other Sibyl, was represented as proclaiming the superiority of the Jewish religion to all others, the falsity of idols, and the identity of the God of the Jews with the God of the universe. Beyond their pure theism, the Sibylline books contained messianic elements. Hence they came to be much appealed to on behalf of Christianity, for which reason Celsus, in his True Word addressed to the Christians, gave them the name of Sibyllists. The appeal to the Greek-speaking world was much facilitated by the Septuagint translation of the Bible, which had proceeded from Alexandria. At the opening of the Christian era, Hebrew existed only as a learned language. The language of Palestine was Aramaic, and the Scriptures, for popular use, needed interpretation into it. Among the Greek-speaking Jews of the Roman Empire, the Septuagint was the version in use. Thus there could be put into the hands of proselytes an authorized collection of literature containing the very revelation which, as their new instructors would tell them, they vainly sought in the mysteries of Phrygia or of Egypt. No other religion could offer them the sacred books of an ancient and still living priesthood translated into the vernacular. 5. The preparation for the gospel. Hopeful as the outlook may have appeared for great conquests of the religion of Israel over the old religions of the Mediterranean world, it was not pure Judaism that was to profit by the situation. The reasons that have ordinarily been assigned for this by Christian apologists are sufficient on the whole, though they lead to unexpected conclusions. But first it may be premised that Hebrew religion had nothing to teach the philosophic schools. Probably the verdict of any religious-minded Platonist would have differed little from that of Julian, that the prophets had indeed, by narrowing their vision for all else, caught a glimpse of one great truth, the unity of directive power in the universe, but that in their expression of it there was more of fire than of light. If any distinct influence could have found access to classical culture, it was on the aesthetic side, and the treatise On the Sublime suffices to prove that a critic with academical standards was not insensitive to the peculiar quality of Hebrew literature. On the side of thought, it was the Jews who underwent influence. With the establishment of amicable relations between Jew and Greek, in a world of continued speculative freedom, this influence would no doubt have gone further. The personality of Jehovah even might have been merged in a pantheistic conception, as it tended to be among small groups of the heterodox in the Middle Ages. This, however, would scarcely have affected the multitude, and it is with the fortunes of popular religion that we are at present concerned. For the many, it is usually said, Judaism had, on the one hand, too much the character of an abstract monotheism, while on the other hand it was too stringent in its demand for the observance of a minute ritual, and of course proselytes from among the heathen could not feel any deep interest in those discussions of the law which were a delight to the pious Pharisee. To become an adept in them would have required a training as difficult in its way as that of the Hellenic schools. But new religions appealed precisely to those who found the path of philosophy arduous. Above all, a pathetic religion was needed. Who was to take the place of the slain and suffering divinities already introduced from the mystic East, of Dionysus and Adonis and Attis and Osiris, of the sorrowing Isis and of Cybele, the mother of the gods? Could Judea, in fashions unknown to its doctors of the law, offer any such objects of devotion? And could that high tone of authority also be retained, which was assumed by proselytizers orthodox in their own national monotheistic religion, who claimed to teach as a divine revelation what had been for the wisest among the Greeks, at best, a result of fallible human reasoning? The former question, as we know, was solved by the emergence of a cult directed to the crucified Son of God. The latter was solved by the destruction of the temple at Jerusalem. The old hierarchy thus overthrown, the way was left clear for a new one to claim the succession to its authority. Such a hierarchy was formed among the groups of societies practicing the cult, and it displayed the requisite vigor and adaptiveness. It soon had sacred books of its own, which it appended to the older scriptures. The generalized ideas of official Judaism, the Messianic hope, Hellenistic myth and ritual, ethical and metaphysical ideas that had passed into currency, and, in particular, the idea of personal salvation in a future life, were all in due proportion assimilated. A new religion had appeared, which at length succeeded in imposing itself in the Roman Empire. By what process did it first emerge? Was the slain God originally a human person, an ethical teacher put to death by the procurator of Judea to appease the Jewish authorities whom his teaching had offended? Did he first, from a prophet or rabbi with a group of disciples, come to be regarded as the Messiah, and then afterwards, on non-Jewish ground, receive full apotheosis? Was the cult, as well as the mythology, thus an accretion, in small part Jewish, in large part Hellenistic, that gathered around an actual human being who was deified? A majority of non-traditionalist critics would probably answer these questions in the affirmative. There is, however, a dissentient minority. Before deciding, we must ask first what evidence there is for the historical events assumed to be recorded in the New Testament. Then, if we find that there is no real evidence, we must go on to ask, in the second place, whether the beginnings of the Christian Church can be explained without supposing its story of Christ to have a basis of fact. Now the Gospels, to which the primary appeal has to be made, cannot be regarded as historical documents. They are of unknown authorship and of composite origin. Their probable date is more than 2 generations after the events they professedly record, and they are of miracle stories all compact. The teacher never appears as a mere human being, but as the Lord, the Son of God. His birth is miraculous. His death on the cross is not described with accompaniments that were those of a Roman execution, but with the characteristic details of various rites of human sacrifice known in all parts of the world from India to Mexico. To all of them a mystic significance is attributed. As a teacher, he from the first claims authority to reverse the decisions of the ancient lawgiver of his nation. If he approves of the law, that too is by his authority. We are remote enough here from memoirs of someone who really lived. Is there, then, any external evidence pointing to some nucleus of actual occurrence? The answer must be that there is none whatever. The only apparent exception is the celebrated passage in the Annals of Tacitus, Book 15, section 44. This passage itself, indeed, defies all skepticism, yet on every side it has been found puzzling. It only becomes clear by the admission that, in the period to which it refers, there was as yet no Christianity in our sense of the term, that is, no belief in a Christ who was said to have appeared at a definite place and time. The account is briefly this. To divert from himself the suspicion of having caused the great fire at Rome in the year 64, for the sake of his ambitious architectural schemes, the Emperor Nero accused those who were commonly called Christians. Christus, the author of that name, had been put to death in the reign of Tiberius by Pontius Pilatus, the procurator. The dire superstition, repressed for a moment, burst forth again and spread from Judea, the original seat of the evil, to Rome itself. Inquiries being now instituted with reference to the conflagration, a vast multitude was in the end seized. The accused were convicted, not so much of having caused the fire as of hatred of the human race. Their punishment was of Neronian atrocity, so that, in spite of the guilt imputed to them, compassion arose for their fate, since it was felt that their sufferings had been inflicted not for the public good, but to satiate the cruelty of one man. A difficulty in this account is the absolute want of plausibility of such a charge against the early Christians of legend. The commentators have pointed out that it would have been much more plausible against apocalyptic Jewish fanatics, and the suggestion has been made that the real Christians were somehow mixed up with these, who formed the chief portion of the vast multitude. On this hint, let us put the extreme hypothesis that there were no Christians at all in our sense, and that there could not be, because the author of the sect was mythical, and the circumstantial form of the myth had not then arisen. We shall find that every statement of Tacitus falls spontaneously into its place. Christians, as we understand the term, existed, of course, in the time of the historian himself, who was writing under Trajan early in the 2nd century. It is to their faith that he applied his memorable phrase. Having been a Roman official, he would know or suspect something of the close and authoritative organization of the rising church, and he may have heard rumors as to the damnatory character of its creed. The almost colorless statement about the founder he would naturally take from what was repeated in common by the Christians of his own day. He would see no reason for rejecting the assertion that the author of a new sect, presumably anti-Roman, had suffered under Pontius Pilate, a procurator detested by the nationalist Jews. To suppose that he may have derived the information from the Roman archives is perfectly gratuitous. He was trying to get at the history of the sect by the procedure known to students of sources as combination. Here is no testimony to the crucifixion independent of the Christian belief, which, in the same age, was incorporated in the Gospels. But why should Christians be spoken of as existing in the time of Nero? And what is the historical basis of the account? There is no difficulty about the answer. By no other name could Greeks or Romans speak of Messianic Jews. Now we know that soon after the date of the Great Fire, the revolt of Judea broke out, which was suppressed by Vespasian and Titus. It may reasonably be inferred from Suetonius, Claudius, section 25, that the tumults he mentions as having gone on among the Jews of Rome earlier were associated with messianic movements. We know also the type of apocalyptic expectations current among the Messianists. At the coming of the anointed king from the east, the secular world state was to be dissolved amid slaughter and universal conflagration, over which the saints of the theocracy would everlastingly exult. When the Jewish community everywhere was seething with preludes of insurrection set going by these hopes, who could be more speciously accused of incendiarism than those among them by whom the Messiah, the Christ, was most vividly expected? And would not the beliefs about the end of all things, which they would confidently express, bring them, in the eyes of the heathen who were to be destroyed, under what might seem justified charge of hatred of the human race, even if it should be made clear that they were falsely accused of setting fire to the city? That a vast multitude of apocalyptic Jews, including perhaps Greek-speaking proselytes, could be arrested in Rome, then largely of foreign population, there is no reason to doubt. So that, if the real victims of Nero were fanatical Jews, the historian need not be accused of exaggerating. With this view, the small amount of reference made for a long time by church writers to the so-called Neronian persecution is in harmony. They knew nothing of it from their own tradition, and, when they came to speak of it, merely transmitted the understandings of Tacitus, who, from the identity of name, had confused the Messianists of Nero's time with the new sect of Christians in the time of Trajan. Still, though there is nothing that can be called historical evidence for the existence of a personal Christ, whose name was adored by a group of believers as early as the reign of Nero, may not the hypothesis be necessary to explain the legend? The Gospels assign his appearance to the reign of Tiberius and to the procuratorship of Pontius Pilate. Cannot this information have been correctly preserved by oral transmission till the accounts were written down early in the 2nd century? I had thought that some such view might be defended, but partly by the arguments of Mr. Robertson, and partly by confirmation of them since met with, I have been led to a different conclusion. The real basis of the Christian community I take to have been, as Mr. Robertson holds, a cult which was connected with a Jesus or Joshua long since conceived as of divine status. The story of a quasi-historic Jesus grew out of immemorial elements of native Semitic ritual and myth, which now rose to the surface after ages of obscure persistence beneath the official and Pharisaic Jewish religion. To form the definite myth, this story combined with Hellenistic stories of similar type, itself undergoing modification in the process. Elements of what is called heathenism are, of course, to be detected in the canonical Hebrew Scriptures. Julian had no difficulty in proving this against the claim that, as a whole, they taught an absolutely pure monotheism. He could even show that the devil worship, of which the Jews and the Christians after them were fond of accusing the nations, was not absent in their own documents. His interpretation of the scapegoat, sacrificed to Azazel, has been confirmed by modern critical science. Thus, there is no paradox if we find in apocryphal or Christian books still more distinct traces of lingering polytheism. A particular confirmation of Mr. Robertson's view, to which I desire to draw attention, is an older reading in the Epistle of Jude, recognized in the margin of the Revised Version. It occurs in verse 5, and its significance is brought out by verse 6. I will therefore put you in remembrance, though ye once knew this, how that Jesus, having saved the people out of the land of Egypt the second time, afterward destroyed them that believed not. The next verse proceeds, And the angels which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, he hath reserved in everlasting chains under darkness unto the judgment of the great day. Plainly, the binding of erring angels can only be attributed to a supernatural being, and not to a mere national hero. And it must be remembered that the epistle is a Judeo-Christian, not a heathen Christian work. With this passage from a book of the New Testament, it is interesting to compare a messianic prophecy from the Sibylline Oracles, translated by the Reverend W. J. Dean, as follows. Now a certain excellent man shall come again from heaven, who spread forth his hands upon the very fruitful tree, the best of the Hebrews, who once made the sun stand still, speaking with beauteous words and pure lips. Here, as Mr. Robertson would say, we observe the conception passing into that of the teaching God. The very fruitful tree, or tree of fair fruit, has reference, of course, to that sacrificial idea of which the implications have been brought out by Mr. Fraser in The Golden Bough. We evidently have here, in the idea already present on Jewish ground, of a believer with divine name and attributes, a possible center of a new growth. This renders superfluous Mr. Fraser's own explanation of the Christian cultus as the starting point of the sacrificial idea into renewed vitality through the death of an actual Jesus, the Galilean teacher, selected by the machinations of sacerdotal hostility as the victim of a surviving annual rite at Jerusalem, in which usually a condemned criminal played the part of a dying God. For Mr. Fraser's tentative hypothesis, there can be substituted a combination of the positive results of his great anthropological investigation with the results, negative as well as positive, of biblical criticism. The particular events related in the Gospels did not happen, but, as Mr. Robertson puts it, the story condenses a whole phase, indeed more than one phase, of religion in a single figure. The human victim is crucified as the incarnation of the God. He has the attributes of a corn god and of a wine god. Hence his body and blood can be partaken of sacramentally by eating bread and drinking wine. He rises again from the dead. His death and resurrection are celebrated annually, at the season when celebrations of the death and new birth of deities, whether representative of the forces of vegetation or of the power of the sun, are usual. With this most archaic conception, according to which the God is slain in his prime so that he may regain his vigor in a new manifestation, a piacular idea is combined. Sinless himself, he was made a sacrifice for the sins of others. His death, therefore, coincides in time with an old piacular rite, the Passover, probably itself derived from a custom of human sacrifice. Then, since the new religion of the incarnate God adopts the sacred books of its predecessor as its own, all other conceptions have to be reconciled with Jewish monotheism. Hence, the problem of Christian theology, handed down from the New Testament to the Fathers, and from the Fathers to the schoolmen. End of introduction, chapters 4 through 5.